Hey everyone, good morning. What a great intro that is, talking about justice, seeking justice, and we're going to be talking about that today, but we're really glad that you're joining us. My name is Nick. Thanks to those of you who are on Facebook and YouTube for hanging out with us a bit today. We want to invite you into this conversation we've been having for a few weeks here, and we're glad that you are joining us. For those of you who sometimes or frequently are with us in person, we're all back online again this week, and I'm happy to say that's not because of COVID in our church community. It seems like everyone's pretty much getting healthy there, but the facility that we normally use for our in-person thing has kind of one thing a year usually that kind of bumps us out of the facility, and it just happened to be this weekend. And so we are all back online again, but we anticipate going forward here that it should be pretty clear sailing. We don't expect to be back online only for quite a while, I hope. In fact, we're looking forward to the end of this month and kind of getting back to some of the rhythms of things that we normally do, like small groups. And, well, I'll tell you all about that at the end. But anyway, we're glad that you're joining us today. If this is your first time kind of finding this group, you might want to find out a little bit more about who we are. We have our core values listed there in the bottom of the corner of the screen. But if you want to know what we mean by some of those words, you can just go to our website at findpathways.com, and you can read up a little bit about us and find out kind of what kind of weird group this is that you've stumbled into. An easy way to get to know us, we often talk about these two words, curious and cautious. We are a cautious bunch in that many of us grew up in religious environments or have been surrounded by religion. And while we do know that religion can be very useful and do some very good things, some of which we're going to talk about today, in fact, we've also seen religion used in ways that harms other people and ourselves. And so many of us find ourselves a little bit skeptical about organized religion. But that doesn't mean that we aren't interested in Jesus. We're very interested in God. We're very interested in the person of Jesus, and that has made us pretty curious. Some of us have had some questions about faith and the Bible and what it means to follow God for a long time. And in certain religious contexts, we didn't feel that it was safe to ask some of those questions. And so this is really a group for those who like to ask questions. We like to ask the Bible a lot of questions, and that leads us down a lot of different things. And so if you find yourself with a lot of questions, interested in seeking some answers, maybe a little cautious about organized religion, this might be a really good group for you. Now, a couple housekeeping things here as we go along. We're going to do some singing now. Billy, our worship leader, as normal, is going to lead us in a couple songs, and in between, there's kind of a reflective video in the middle. And then after that, I'm going to come back and we're going to continue this series on the book of Ruth that we've begun that really has a lot to do with justice and taking care of the poor and the powerless. And so we're going to be jumping into that again this week. Really excited about this particular message. I think there's going to be an insight for you here that perhaps you've never had before. And then after that, we are going to take communion. We'll carve out a little space for that. And so this would be a good time if you're, if you're at your house right now, maybe grab a cracker, get some bread, get some little bit of wine from last night or some juice or something, Diet Coke, I don't care. Just grab something to eat, something to drink, and we're going to take communion later. Those two things, they just represent the body and the blood of Jesus, and we like to take them each week because Jesus told us to, and because it's a good way for us to be reminded of the love that he has for us, and then, of course, the love that we are to extend to others. Okay, so that's pretty much it here in the housekeeping things. Billy's going to lead us in some singing now, and go get those communion things, and then we'll get back here and we'll start up the message this morning. Billy, take us away!
Song of all songs is the song we sing. Song of our sounds have a symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out loud as heaven is up. comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong and powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. Sing song of all. Song of all songs is the song we sing. Sound of all sounds, heaven's symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong and powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. Sing that again. You are great and greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong and powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. Yeah, you are to be praised. We're gonna sing it out loud. Let's sing, you are great. You are great, greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong, powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. You are great and greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong and powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised.
Brown-skinned God, look upon the world you have entered with compassion, even to those who hung you up on that tree, for healing the sick and being with the despised, for seeing us as your image, mirror of the divine, all daughters and sons, helping them to paint a canvas with their pain, rendering their cries into poetry, words heard without need for refrain. As you sink down into the cursed cross, suffocating, you breathe your last. Brown-skinned God, do not abandon us, both those who hung you there and those who took you down, to clean your battered and bloodied body, treating it as if it were the same flesh and blood, the same fragile skin, that thing that separates you from me, that thing we all share.
Beloved Father, please come down and meet us. We are waiting on your touch. Open up the heavens, shower down your presence. We respond to your great love. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. We don't want anything but you. Our beloved Jesus, we just want to see you in the glory of your light. Earthly things don't matter, they just fade and shatter when we're touched by love divine. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. And we don't want anything but you. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. We don't want anything but you. Anything but you, God. Here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms. Here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms, yeah. Here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms. Yeah, here we go, let's go to the throne, the place that we belong, right into his arms. Here we go, let's go to the throne, a place that we belong, right into his arms. Oh, here we go, let's go to the throne, a place that we belong, right to his arms. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. See, we won't be satisfied. We won't be satisfied with anything ordinary. We won't be satisfied at all. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. We don't want anything but you. Open up the sky, fall down like rain. We don't want blessings, we want you. Open up the sky, fall down like fire. And we don't want anything but you. Oh, we won't be satisfied. We won't be satisfied. Oh, anything but you. Earthly things don't matter, they just fade and shatter when we're touched by love divine.
All right, here we are, and there is no football this weekend. I mean, not really. I think the Pro Bowl is going on this weekend, which, I mean, that's a fascinating game for sure. But here we are, and we are 1 week away from the Super Bowl. I mean, can you believe it? We're almost back to the Super Bowl again. Go Bengals, by the way. I think that's going to be a fun matchup. I'd love to see Joe Burrow and those Bengals win. And maybe we got some Rams fans around here. But I mean, come on. Most of us cheer for the Seahawks, so it's going to be pretty hard to cheer for the Rams in the Super Bowl. So go Bengals. So excited for next week and the Super Bowl and all of that. But the NFL, even though there's no football really this weekend, the NFL was still in the news quite a bit this week. For instance, did you see Tom Brady is retiring? I mean, I can't believe it. Didn't see it coming either. Tom Brady is 44 going on 45 years old, which is ancient, but somehow his retirement still feels too early. Like, wow, man, you could have played for, he had one of his best seasons this year, and here he is retiring. Huge news in the NFL this week. Tom Brady is retiring. But probably bigger news even than that was something else that happened this week in the NFL. Didn't have anything to do with Tom Brady, but a coach in the NFL is suing the league and 3 teams for several reasons, one of which is racism. And it's a very interesting case, actually. Currently, there is only one black head coach in the entire NFL, which is what this coach has been pointing out. In fact, it is a pretty interesting league in that we have one black head coach. There are 7 black general managers. However, like 3 of them were added just this year. There's only 4 black offensive coordinators in all of the NFL, and there are absolutely 0 majority black owners in the NFL. All while the players themselves, almost 70% of them are African American. And so this is a pretty interesting litany of statistics here that people have pointed to and saying, hey, why aren't there more African American people in places of leadership in the NFL? And this week, this came up again because of something you may have never heard of called the Rooney Rule. And you say, this is interesting. We started this sermon and we're learning a lot about sports. Well, here we are. I kind of like sports, right? So maybe you've heard of the Rooney Rule, maybe you haven't, but the case that came up this week has a lot to do with the Rooney Rule. Now, the NFL has a special rule called the Rooney Rule, and it means that teams must interview at least one minority candidate for every open head coaching position. And this rule came about when Tony Dungy and Dennis Green got fired in the same year, something like 15, 20 years ago. And the NFL, again, did not have very many black head coaches, and so they came up with this Rooney Rule. They made a rule. And it was a well-intentioned rule, and it looked pretty good from the outside. You just make a rule that teams must at least interview one minority candidate for each job. And of course, the idea here is let's get more diverse people coming into these environments where they have a chance to actually get the job. Now, Brian Flores this week, he was the head coach of the Miami Dolphins, but he lost his position and he was looking for a new job, and he had his name in for the New York Giants job. Why would you want to be the coach of the New York Giants? I have no idea. But Brian Flores had his name in for the job, and he got a text last week from his old boss, Bill Belichick. He was on his staff back in the day, and Belichick had heard through his channels that Brian was getting the New York Giants job and texted him to tell him congratulations. And that's nice. You know, he used to be on Bill's staff. Seems like a very nice congratulatory text. But the only problem was that Brian Flores had not even interviewed for the New York Giants job yet. And it turns out that Bill Belichick had made a mistake and texted the wrong Brian in his phone. He meant to text Brian Daboll, not Brian Flores. And Brian Daboll has already been told at this point, allegedly, that he has gotten the job with the New York Giants. And so now Brian Flores here realizes that he's about to go through the motions on an interview for a job that has already been filled. Oops, that's an embarrassing text message to send. Now, technically, the Giants here were following the letter of the law for the Rooney Rule, right? I mean, there's nothing that says you have to take every minority candidate that you interview seriously or that you have to hire them. You just have to interview them. And I suppose the rule doesn't stipulate that you can't make a decision who you're going to hire before you interview that person. So they were following the letter of the law. But of course, the spirit of the law of the Rooney Rule is to give minority candidates a viable chance at a job. But the reality is that many black coaches and coach candidates will tell you that this happens a lot, that teams just have to fulfill the letter of the rule, but that the spirit of the rule isn't always there. And so Brian Flores is suing the NFL and several teams this week because he wants to bring to attention, by suing the NFL, the problems with this rule. He wants people to see that this rule, while perhaps well-intended, just doesn't quite work from his perspective as one whom it is supposed to help. And this is actually a really good example of what we are going to read today in our story. We are going to encounter a rule, not the Rooney Rule, but another rule that sort of looks different depending on which side of the rule you are on. And sometimes, we're going to discover today, you can have a very well-intentioned rule, but it may not work for those who it tries to help. Now, the series that we're doing is called Undocumented Love, Crossing Borders in the Book of Ruth. And we are studying this short story of Ruth. We call it the Book of Ruth. It's really just a short story. You can read it in 15 minutes, and you should. It's a great story. And it is considered by some literary people to be the single greatest short story ever written. But in case you have missed it to this point, it feels like you might need a brief, and I will stress brief, recap. Because previously in our story, we need imaging for this. Do we have any imaging for this?
Previously on
Ruth.
I love that imaging. Can we hear that again?
Previously on
Ruth.
Excellent. It's got that nice, almost picking up a little Liev Schreiber vocals in there, and then like a very harshly edited someone else's voice saying Ruth. But that's the kind of professionalism you have come to expect here with our group. Now, previously on Ruth, we met this family, okay? We met a family, a mom, a dad, and 2 sons, and they were living in a town called Bethlehem. Oh, little town of Bethlehem. Jesus town. They were living there. Bethlehem means house of bread, and what we learn early on in the story is that Bethlehem is not living up to its name. There is a famine going on there. There's no bread. And so this family experiencing famine decides to move as famine refugees out of Israel, out of Bethlehem, to a foreign land called Moab. And Moab is made up of a group of people, the Moabites, who are sort of hated by the people of Israel. They are enemies of Israel. So they're moving into enemy territory as foreign refugees. Well, things get worse as they get there. Once they get into town, the father, Elimelech, dies and leaves the mother and her 2 sons alone. And so mom, Naomi, she marries off her 2 sons to some local girls, and they live there for about 10 years. But during those 10 years, neither of the sons and their wives have any children. There are no males, there are no females, there are no children born. And then, of course, tragedy strikes again, and the 2 sons both die, which leaves only the 3 women. And so the mother, Naomi, hears at this point that the famine has let up in Bethlehem, and she decides to return home, to go back to Israel. And she brings along her daughters-in-law with her. We saw this last week. They get out on the road a little bit, and she pulls off the highway, and she tells her daughters-in-law, by the way, I don't want you coming all the way back home with me. You need to go back to your own families, your families of origin. And the reason she's doing this is not because she doesn't like her daughters-in-law, but actually because she loves them so much. And she knows that going home, she is going to be a widow, and they are going to be widows as well, and foreigners to boot. And she knows that in the patriarchal society that they live in, that is going to condemn them to a life of destitution, basically. And so she thinks that the best hope that they have for any sort of life is to go home to their family of origin. And so she commands them to leave. And one of the daughters-in-law leaves, but the other one, Ruth, refuses to leave. And in this epic moment, this huge, like X marks the spot moment on the road from Moab to Bethlehem, Ruth declares her loyalty and love to Naomi and to her God, Yahweh. And so she refuses to leave and goes home with Naomi to Bethlehem. Okay, that pretty much gets you caught up. Lots of bad stuff happens in chapter 1. But it does end with the narrator pulling us aside at the end of chapter 1 and telling us something hopeful, okay? That they have come back to Bethlehem, he tells us, at the beginning of the barley harvest. And that is actually a cue here of good news because they've come back to Bethlehem in a time where food is being produced again. And chapter 2, Scene 2 starts with the narrator pulling us aside again and making another comment for those of us following the story. Ruth 2, verse 1, Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, the narrator here interjects into the story like narrators sometimes do in a story. It kind of reminds me of The Office. You ever watch that show, The Office? And they would just kind of turn to the camera, the characters would, and address those of us in the audience rather than the other characters in the TV show with them. And that is sort of what the narrator does here, pivots away from the characters in the story, looks at us, takes a pause, and wants to introduce us to a new character that we have not yet met. And his name is Boaz. And the narrator tells us that Boaz isn't just some guy, that he's a pretty big deal. He's a well-respected man in Bethlehem. The Hebrew term here is Hayil, and it means a man of valor or strength. And it's often used to describe a person of high social standing, right? Someone who's respected. But oftentimes that also means wealthy. And the term itself connotes this idea of strength. In fact, many people suggest that this is actually, maybe even Boaz is a military hero. This is a term that is sometimes used of military heroes. And that actually makes a lot of sense, given that the time period that this story is said to take place in is during the time of the Judges. And that is a time when Israel is in a lot of skirmishes and battles with people around them. And so it is possible that Boaz here is a sort of celebrated military hero. But the most important thing to know about Boaz that we learn here is he is an Israelite man of high standing and influence. And the reason that's important is because the narrator, the author here, wants to right away compare that with another character we really get to know well in this scene, and that is Ruth. And what the author wants us to see here is this giant contrast between Boaz and Ruth. Ruth is everything that Boaz is not. She is not an Israelite, she is a Moabite, okay? And these two people could not be any more different. There is a high contrast here between these characters. Boaz is an insider Israelite. Ruth is an outsider Moabitess. Boaz is a man, which in this society holds a lot of privilege and power. Ruth is a woman, which does not hold those privileges and power. Boaz is wealthy, well-to-do, well-off. Ruth has nothing. She is empty, poorest of the poor. Boaz is respected and looked up to. Ruth, as a foreigner and a widow, is an outcast. Boaz has all of this political and legal power, and Ruth has no even protection for herself. You get the contrast here? These two people couldn't be any more different, and the narrator right away wants to remind us of this by introducing us to Ruth, even though we know who she is. Ruth 2, verse 2, and Ruth, just in case you forgot, audience, the Moabitess, not an Israelite like Boaz, okay? And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Now, the author right away here reminds us that Ruth is a foreigner, and not just any foreigner. She is a Moabitess, right? The worst kind of foreigner for those who are Israelites. But she has refused to leave Naomi and found her way all the way home with her, and she has made a vow to take care of Naomi. And so she asks her mother-in-law if she can go and glean. And Naomi agrees, and you'll notice it was very briefly. She just simply, where's this verse here? She just said, "Go, my daughter." All right? I mean, there's not a lot to that response. You'd expect, since we're in a foreign land here, and Ruth may not be really aware of all the rules around gleaning, that maybe she'd give her some instruction, some guidance, some warning, some things of what to expect. But she's very brief. She just says, "Go, my daughter." And this is probably because gleaning is demeaning business, and it really highlights your the lack of resources that you have and how poor you are in society. And it's probably all Naomi can do to just say, "Go, my daughter." Now, we need to stop here and talk about gleaning. I remember a guy who was in our church when I was a kid who was a gleaner. And I didn't know what that was, until I got to meet him, and really until I saw his garage. And you open up his garage, and he had all these shelves with food. It was like a food bank in his garage. And he told me he was a gleaner. And what that meant was he went to grocery stores, and he would pull up in the back alley where the dumpster is at the grocery stores. And the grocery stores, when they get things that were past date that could no longer be sold, they would wheel them out to the alleyway out towards the dumpsters. They were things that needed to be discarded. But these were some things that were still good, that could still be eaten. It's just that they were past their best date, right? And so the store had to throw them out, but what he would do is glean. He would take those things that were discarded, that were headed for the dumpster, he would collect them, he would put them in his garage, and then he functioned as a food bank so that people who did not have enough food could come and shop out of his garage for free. And it was a really cool ministry. And it's sort of the idea of gleaning. Gleaning is collecting leftovers or discarded goods. And in an organized way, as a ministry, it looked like that old guy from my church growing up. But in an unorganized way, for some people, gleaning simply means just a dumpster dive, to just try to find the scraps of what other people have left behind. Now, gleaning in our story here, though, is a very specific thing. And it's really important that you understand this for the weight of this story to hit you. You see, gleaning was not just a nice thing to allow poor people to do. Gleaning was actually a legally mandated command of God to the Israelite people. It was sort of a mandated welfare system for Israel. Now, there was a requirement here that stated multiple times in the Old Testament that those who have land and the ability to produce food and wealth need to also have a requirement to provide food for those who do not have anything to eat, specifically the poor, the foreigner, the immigrant, and we'll also see the widow. Now, this is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. Probably the easiest place is Leviticus 19, 9-10. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field. Okay? You can harvest your field, but you got to leave the very outer edge. Or gather the gleanings of your harvest. What are gleanings? They're the parts that are left behind after the people come through harvesting. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Okay, specific command here. This is a mandated social safety net. For those of you who own the land, you are to not reap to the edges of your field, and you're not to pass over your field more than once, because anything left over after that is for those who do not have enough to eat. It's mentioned again a few chapters later in Leviticus 23, 22, very similar wording. But really, even in Deuteronomy, we have Moses repeating this law to the people, and he even specifically mentions not just the poor and the foreigner, but also the widow. And at the very end, in verse 22, he even points out why God thinks this is so important, because he's saying, remember, you all were also on the bottom of the social scale, came into this promised land with nothing. You know what it feels like to be a foreigner, an immigrant, one who is vulnerable. And so thus you should protect those who find themselves in the same predicament. Now, that is gleaning. It's sort of an early pre-modern welfare system. And it is a very biblical idea. Now, the idea here is when you harvest your fields, you're not to be completely efficient. You can't go all the way to the edge, okay? You can't harvest the whole field. You got to leave the borders. And you can't go over it twice, only once. And then anything left is for those who are in need. And so it's sort of like the food stamps or the social safety net of its time. It's the idea of this social safety net for those who are poor and vulnerable is actually a very biblical idea and command. And it goes well beyond this gleaning law, but that's the part of it that we are going to discuss today. Now, of course, people are smart, and they began to question this law. And so some landowners asked the question, is this even really necessary? I mean, I own the land, and shouldn't I be the one to profit from it? And if these people need food, why don't they just work harder to get their own land? And so there were some people who actually refused gleaners into their field. We're going to learn that Boaz here is a law-abiding citizen who allows gleaners in his field. But some at this time are even questioning whether you need to do that. And then, of course, others are questioning the specifics of the law. Okay, I'll allow gleaners into the field, but exactly what defines the edge of my field? I mean, when you read the verses that command allowing for gleaning here, it says don't reap to the edges of your field. But people started to question, okay, exactly what is the edge? Is it 3 feet from the border? Is it 1 foot? Is it just one kernel of barley, one strand of barley. I mean, what exactly is the edge? And so they would push that as far as possible to maximize their profits. Then other people started asking the question, how could I put together a workforce that will be as efficient as possible, that they could go in one pass and harvest the most amount of grain possible, leaving the least behind, right? Because they want to maximize profits and production. You see, what they were questioning here was the letter of the law. What can I do technically that doesn't break the law, but still gets me the most productivity and profit? And it makes sense, right? You could probably imagine business owners asking similar questions today. Now, the solution was that there were great work crews. Men would come along at first, and they would cut down sheaves of grain. They were the reapers, okay? They would just make sure and just cut. And then there would be a group of women following along behind them who would be the gatherers, who were gathering up everything that was falling. So instead of having one team that is responsible for cutting and gathering, you split it into two rows as they go down so that you can maximize the production. The problem is, the benefit is they got as much out of their field as they could, but the problem was it left very little for those who were in need and were gleaning. And so gleaners could show up to these fields and spend all day picking over whatever scraps were left, but still not end up with enough to even survive. And gleaning was actually pretty dangerous. One reason it was dangerous was you were competing with other gleaners who were there looking for food as well. And there wasn't very much resource there. And so you begin to fight over what meager resources you can find. And so that became dangerous. It was also dangerous because you were there in the fields with the work crew. And the work crew was rather low on the social scale as well, often bossed around, sometimes mistreated. And they did not look kindly on the gleaners and would often take out their aggression on the gleaners, would abuse them. But widows in particular were very vulnerable as gleaners because they could be taken advantage of. Many were abused and even raped because they had no male protectors in the society. Even if somebody did abuse them or rape them, there was no male to stand up for them in court and to bring it to justice. So this is a very dangerous occupation. But Ruth doesn't know what else to do. She has to do something. She's made this vow. She's taken this huge vow to be with Naomi, to protect her. And so she is going to risk it. Ruth 2, verse 3. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now, it's an interesting phrase here, used almost nowhere else in the Old Testament, where she happened to come to a field. Or maybe a better way to translate this was, by chance, she ended up in the field of Boaz. She just so happens to come to the field that belongs to this character that the narrator just introduced us to at the beginning, this character Boaz. And she starts to glean there. But a fascinating scene happens next, because Boaz himself now shows up and he sees something he has never seen before. He's a landowner. Maybe he's seen it all, but he has never seen this. Ruth 2, verse 4. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord Yahweh be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord Yahweh bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Now, this is actually a really incredible scene, because Boaz arrives in the field and he greets his workers in the name of Yahweh. "May Yahweh bless you." And they repeat it back to him. And it is a greeting. It's a blessing. that really it's also a prayer that Boaz is making that Yahweh will be present in the field. And of course, we know he's already there and up to something. But Boaz is intentionally inviting Yahweh into his place of work. And we get an insight here into what type of man Boaz is. But then he has this fascinating interaction with the head foreman. Because Boaz sees his head foreman, kind of the manager of the field, and he walks over to him and he says, "Hey, there's someone out there and I don't know who she is." And he says, "Whose young woman is this?" And it's this point that we normally start to tell the story of Ruth, and we kind of picture Boaz coming into the field, and he looks out and he sees Ruth, and he is just awestruck by her beauty. You know, like she's just gorgeous, and it's love at first sight, and he's attracted to her. And so he comes up to his foreman and he goes, "Who is that? You need to introduce me," right? That's kind of the way that we've often told the story of Ruth. But if we read carefully, I think we'll see that there's something else that's happening here. You see, because the question that Boaz asks in verse 6, the question that he asks actually in verse 5 is, "Whose young woman is this?" Or who does she belong to? Now, it isn't who is that, it's who does she belong to? And this is an unusual phrase. It's usually used to describe someone who is a slave or a servant. Who does she work for? And it's easy to see why Boaz might be asking this particular question, because when he sees her, it appears that she's doing something different than just gleaning. It appears that she is part of his workforce. Because when we read the text carefully, we notice that she isn't doing the normal gleaning, going behind, all of the reapers and then the gatherers. It says that she's following along behind the reapers along with the gatherers. And so he sees her and thinks, that's weird. I know my workers pretty well, and I've never seen this one before. He's familiar with his employees. He is not familiar with her. And so he asks the foreman, "Whose young woman is this? Who does she work for?" And the foreman actually even confirms this when he explains who she is, right? In verse 6, he tells us the servant, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. Okay, apparently people have been talking about her and everything that's happened, and she's come to glean. But she has apparently requested from the foreman something that is very unusual. And verse 7 tells us that she asked him to please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. And this is a very unusual request, because she is not asking to glean. She doesn't need to ask to do that. The law guarantees that she can do that. But what most scholars think that she is actually asking here is she is asking to sort of glean along with the workforce who is gathering up the grain. Not behind them, picking up the leftovers, but to actually join the women who are gathering up from what the male reapers ahead of them are cutting. And it appears that the foreman has allowed her to do this, and he's explaining this to Boaz, perhaps a little unsure of how Boaz is going to respond to this decision to let her do this. And what you have to see in the story is this is an incredibly bold move by Ruth. I mean, she's supposed to be there to glean, but she is doing something much more. She's asking for something much more. It's like she showed up, a poor, hungry person, and she got to the grocery store, walked in the back alley, and instead of dumpster diving and finding whatever scraps of food she could find in the garbage, it's like she went inside, asked the store manager, "Can I just go pick the stuff off the shelf that I need?" And he has allowed her to do this, and now the store owner has come and said, "Wait, who's that lady taking stuff off the shelves," right? She's not there just to dumpster dive. She's asked to go in the store and pick things off the shelf. You see the difference? This is a really bold request by Ruth. And the big question of this scene is, what will Boaz do? You see, the law says that he must let her glean. But what if the law isn't enough? What if it's a well-intentioned rule? But what if, like the Rooney Rule, even though it's well-intentioned, what if it isn't actually helping the people it's intended to help? You see, from Boaz's perspective, he's already following the law by allowing Ruth to glean. But all of a sudden here in this story, he's confronted with a new perspective. The perspective of this daring woman who actually lives on the margin, who lives on the other side of this rule than Boaz does. And she is saying, this rule, it's not enough. It won't provide for me. And so she introduces to him by her daring courage a perspective that he has perhaps never considered. And he is confronted with, what does the gleaning rule look like if you live on the margins? Because you see, you could spend all day working, and if the reapers and the gatherers have done their best, most efficient job, the stuff that you collect as gleanings will never be enough. The gleaning rule could exist, but you'll still die. And this becomes the big decision point in this story. The big decision point for Boaz. Ruth had hers last week, right? The big decision point where she chose to go all in with Naomi and Yahweh. But this is really Boaz's big decision point. And his big decision is between the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. There's a rule here. There's a law here, a gleaning law. And the letter of the law says you must let them glean. But the spirit of the law, it says, feed them. And that may not be the same thing. You see, you could fulfill the letter of the law and allow them to glean. But the spirit of the law says, feed them. And what will Boaz do? Will he just live to the letter of the law? Or will he embrace the spirit of the law? And Ruth's daring, bold move here and request has forced him to make a decision between these two things. Now, most of the landowners, oftentimes were looking to just do the very minimum. But this is Boaz, who when he enters his fields, asks Yahweh himself to be present in the field. And for a man who asks Yahweh to be present in his workplace, this confrontation with Ruth necessitates that he ask not what is the minimum he can do, but what more can he do? And wow, he does a lot more. Let's read this next section, verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." And then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. And when she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also, you should pull purposely out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Wow, now there is so much incredible detail in this part of the story that we don't have time to cover all of these things, but I just want to point out a couple of them to you. First of all, she asks to glean right with the workforce, and Boaz grants her request. He tells her she can continue to work the fields, not as a gleaner, but as a gatherer, although what she gathers won't be given to him for productivity, but that she will take it home with her. Another incredible thing he does is he serves her water. It's kind of like a boss showing a new hire around the office place, and he points out the water cooler and he gives her access to that. And then he goes even beyond that. He feeds her lunch. It's lunchtime, union break or whatever, and they go to lunch. But Ruth didn't bring any food, obviously, so he provides for her. It says that he serves her this roasted grain, which is probably like bread. And you may not notice this if you don't know your Jewish history, but there's an interesting callback here, because the reason why Israelites hate the Moabites has to do with when the people of Israel were coming into the promised land. And in that story, as they came to the promised land, the Moabites were there and they refused to give them any water or bread. Two things, okay? They didn't give them any water and they didn't give them any bread, and then they sent someone out into the fields to curse them. We read it in Deuteronomy 23, 3-4. No Ammonite or, here we go, Moabite or any of their descendants may ever enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. In other words, we don't like these guys. Why? Because verse 4, they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam to pronounce a curse on you. Why don't we like these Moabites? Well, because when we came into the promised land, they didn't do several things for us. They didn't give us bread and they didn't give us water, and then they sent someone else and he pronounced a curse on us. But here is now Boaz, who then gives Ruth the Moabite some water, bread, and then blesses her. And this is a reversal of action, right? Whereas when the Israelites came into town, the Moabites did not give them bread, water, and curse them. Now Boaz here, and the beautiful telling by the narrator, does the exact opposite of that with the Moabite and gives her bread and water and blesses her. And here the narrator, the author, is telling us that this way of Yahweh is very different than the way of others. And Boaz is living into this way. So much so that he has his workers even help her. They intentionally just start giving her grain, right? Dropping it so that she can pick it up. And now they give her more than she can even probably carry. At the end of the day, she ends up with an ephah, which is, you may not be weighing things in ephahs, okay? So an ephah could be anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds of grain. That is a lot. A daily wage for these guys who are working in the field is probably about 1.5 pounds of grain, and she's going to end up with 30 to 50 pounds of grain. This is just a huge amount that he has blessed her with. But why would Boaz do this? Why would he agree to do all this to help Ruth? Well, Boaz himself tells us in verse 11. He tells us that he has been told all that she has done for her mother-in-law since the males of her family had passed away. And the word there is really, I have heard of all the chesed, all of the love, all of the loyalty, all of the sacrifice that you have provided to Naomi. It's been made known to me. And now, Boaz, because she has shown hesed to Naomi, is going to show hesed to her. And in verse 12 here, Boaz prays that she will find refuge under the wings of God himself. And it's become clear, as we, as people reading the story, discover, it's become pretty clear that the manner in which this refuge will take place under the wing of God is through people like Boaz who are willing to extend their own wing to provide for her. And isn't that how it often works? That Boaz prays for her to find refuge. But does he realize that he is also God's answer to that prayer? Wow. The story's challenging, isn't it? It's a challenging scene. Because I find myself often as a person who is not the one on the margin. In the Rooney rules of life, I am often on the side where the rule seems just perfectly fine. Sometimes I even find myself looking to do the minimum to meet the standards. But this story wants us to see the other side of the Rooney rule. This story wants us to catch a glimpse of what the rule and the law looks like from the outside, from the margins, from someone needing more than a rule to survive. And Ruth says, it's time to change the rule. We can do better. And that's what Ruth has done here. She has broken the cultural rules. She has refused to just be a gleaner. Instead, she asks to be fed. She is appealing to the spirit of the rule, not the letter of the law. And in doing so, she is incredibly bold and brave. And she is willing to point out that this law is not enough, and she challenges it. And what is so incredible here is that the person who does have all the influence and the power, he sees her, he notices her, he listens to her. In fact, he even learns from her, and then he leverages all of his privilege for her. He makes sacrifices and shows her chesed, love. The question of this scene is, what will Boaz do? But as those of us reading the story, it sort of begs a similar question of us. What will we do? You know, who is it that we need to see? Who is it that we drive past too quickly, too easily? We don't even notice. We're not sure what things look like from their perspective. Who is it that we need to slow down, take a walk through the field and notice? Who is it that we need to not just notice but actually listen to? To hear their voice, to hear what things are like from their perspective, to actually listen to them. And not just to listen to them, but to actually learn from them. To realize that perhaps we don't have all the answers, that maybe we need to hear from people on the other side of the Rooney rule and feel like and discover from their perspective, does this actually help? And then, of course, to go beyond that and to leverage all of our privilege on behalf of them. What are the Rooney rules that we need to rethink from the perspective of those outside the place of privilege? And see, it is that tension that is really what it means to live a life of faith. How are we going to begin to cross these borders and show love? Well, it means we are going to have to reflect heavily on whether we are willing to follow just the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. And in those conversations, that is where faith lives. That's what it means to live in a way of faith in Yahweh. That's what it means to invite Yahweh into our fields of work and play. If we are going to invite Yahweh into our areas of influence of work and play, we are going to have to ask the question, who is it that we need to show chesed, love, to? This is the way of love. To love our neighbors as ourselves. And so as we finish chapter 2, the question left hanging in the air like some sort of cliffhanger going into the next scene is, will we join Boaz? Will we be like Boaz? Hey God, we want to come to you today with that question ringing in our heads. We want to come to you being challenged by first of all, the daring, bold behavior of Ruth, which forces an issue on Boaz that he perhaps had previously not seen. But we also want to come to you with the boldness of Boaz on our minds as he chooses to see Ruth, listen to her, learn from her, and become willing to change his approach when he sees that the spirit of the law is not being met. Forgive us, God, for those times when we follow the letter of the law, but we miss the spirit of the law. When we're willing to let people glean but not feed them. And we pray that you would begin to sort of irritate us a bit, to cause a little bit of tension inside us as we begin to ask these questions of what does it mean to truly love our neighbors, to love others as ourselves. God, we believe that you've done that you've already modeled for us what it looks like, that you've stepped into history as one of us, that you've loved us when you could have come in and we'd made a mess of the world. You could have just swatted us out of existence, burned the whole thing down, started over. But instead of coming at us that way, you chose to become one of us, to come under us, to support us, to love us, to allow whatever evil and selfishness we had sown into the world to rebound, not on us, but onto you yourself, and to take that punishment for us to die and to come back to life. We thank you for that. We thank you for all the beauty that has given us, the way it's shown us how to live. But we pray also that spirit would live inside of us, that as we go to communion this morning, that we would be reminded of your love and also inviting that type of love into the fields we work and play in today. We love you, Jesus, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. We're going to go to communion, so if you've got a couple elements around you and you want to take communion, you can do that, and then we'll come back with a couple announcements here this morning. So let's go to communion.
Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. Wait upon the Lord, we will wait upon the Lord. Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Our God, you reign forever. Our hope, our strong deliverer. Us up on wings like eagles. Sing the rises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Sing the rises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Our God, you reign forever. upon wings like eagles. Sing the rising, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Sing the rising, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord.
All right, thanks, Billy. We just have a couple announcements here as we wrap up today. First of all, we expect to be in person again next week. That should definitely happen. So those of you who like to be in person, meet at our normal place at our normal time, and we'll be back there again. And we assume that we won't be taking off from there anytime in the near future, that we should be doing both online and in person here for the rest of the year. That's the hope. Also, if you'd like to give, you can do that. If you want to financially support the Pathways Church community, you can do that by going to our website at findpathways.com/donate, or you can text in a dollar amount to the number 84321. And we just want to say thank you to so many of you who are financially supporting the work of this church, and none of what we're doing could be possible without those type of gifts, and so we want to thank you for that. A couple things coming up as well. We have some things we just kind of feel like the Omicron wave is coming down, and I think for a lot of us then we kind of feel like, all right, it's time to start getting back to some semblance of normal. I think most of us who meet in person are vaccinated, and many of us have already been sick, and so we kind of feel like, man, we got a time here. We should just keep getting back together again. And a little bit back to normal. So we have a few things by the end of this month. We're assuming the cases will drop down. We'll continue to get lower. And so we have a couple things we want to do. First of all, Sunday, February 20th, near the end of the month, we're going to do a kind of soup Sunday. And we are going to organize things on that Sunday morning in our in-person gathering differently than we have been doing. And we're going to gather together, and we're going to talk about what were some of your struggles during the last 2 years. And also, what are some things that you feel like we need to discuss as a community going forward? Things that you've been wondering about, thinking about, things that you need to rethink, deconstruct, reconstruct. What are some of those things? And so we're going to get together, talk about that, and then we're just going to have lunch afterwards, and it'll be sort of a soup potluck deal. So if you have a great crock pot recipe that you want to bring a crock pot full of soup and share, we'll have bread provided and drinks and all that. And man, we haven't just had a time to sit around and eat food together in a long time. So we're going to do that on the 20th, and we'd love to have you join us if you would like to do that. Then also, starting up again here in March, we're going to be doing Theology Pub again. And Theology Pub, if you hadn't been a part of that, we would meet in a local pub, we get drinks, we get food, and then we'd sort of talk about different topics, which were the kind of the nexus of discussions on faith and culture. And we'd have a fun time just kind of in a casual format, unpacking some things, sometimes a scripture story we would read, sometimes we'd talk about a topic, but we had a lot of fun doing that, and it was one of our groups, and we haven't met in 2 years because of the COVID thing. And so in March, we are going to start that up again, along with some other groups for, we used to have home groups and all that stuff. So we're going to do some of that again as well. So there's a lot coming up at the end of this month and into next month as we try to find a way back to sort of our normal things about what it means to be a church community together that likes each other and wants to hang out. So pay attention and for things like that, announcements that are coming. And one of the great ways to get information is through our email newsletter. If you don't already receive this, you can message us on Facebook with your name and email, or you can email me. My name is on the screen, and we would love to get you signed up for our email newsletter so that you can receive that. Now, the only other thing is, as we get done here today, we are going to be doing a practice group. So we did this 2 weeks ago. We're going to launch a Zoom. The Zoom information is on the screen here. If you want to just take a screenshot of that, the Zoom number and the password are on the screen. You can log into that Zoom as soon as this live stream ends. And we are just going to take a few moments, instead of just saying, hey, how are you, blah, blah, blah. We're actually going to talk about some of the things that we discussed in the sermon today and practice, kind of exploring the text together. And the questions that we're going to really focus on are on the screen here. What did I learn? What challenged me? What do I need to explore further? What was I feeling around some of these things? Did it make me mad what Nick said? Did it provide some sort of relief? Was I Was I scared about what that could mean for me? All sorts of things, right? Where did your emotions go? So we'll just have a chance to kind of debrief some of what we just talked about, and we'd love to have you join us. So if you want to join us, just take a screenshot of the Zoom information here, and then as soon as this live stream ends, we'd love for you to join us in that. We'll probably be there for 45 minutes and have a short discussion, and then get to the Pro Bowl, because I'm sure everybody wants to see that for today. All right, that's pretty much it for this week. Next week is the Super Bowl, but we'll still be here. Super Bowl's not until later in the afternoon, so we can still be together in person again and here online. Otherwise, hope you have a really great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.